I don't know, yeah, that, I think.
Because they sent me an email earlier this month, because during class, I checked my phone, it says, student Barbara admissions office, and I'm like, and it says, oh, you're not your admission bureau, like, they're all.
Right.
Oh, it's 6:25 on Wednesday. We can do that.
Oh, we can do that.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Okie dokie. Here's sign in sheet. Okay, so continuing on with chemical signals, all right, hormones. Okay, so first of all, yesterday I went over some of the general principles that apply to endocrine hormones, all the details, and started now looking at specific types of hormones. So we've gone through the posterior pituitary, in which case both the two types of hormones here, ADH and oxytocin. These are peptides, and they are produced by neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the anterior pituitary, okay, is right next to it. It has a different embryological origin. Okay, in the embryo, it usually originates up in the mouth region instead of near the brain, but during embryological development, it moves back and joins to the posterior pituitary. Still, the hormone, and it produces a lot of hormones. Okay, it has clusters of cells in them that will produce very particular types of hormones and release them. The control of releasing these hormones is stimulus from the hypothalamus. Okay, so in this case, the hypothalamus releases, there's still neurosecretory cells. They release their releasing hormones or their inhibiting hormones into a short portal system. Okay, so there's capillaries around the hypothalamus and then a short little vessel. So we have the hypothalamus here, and down here is the, well, it's hung down here, the anterior pituitary. There's a different color for the capillaries. So there are capillaries right in here, and then just a single vesicle that comes down here, and then we have capillaries again. So these neurosecretory cells, they will release, they're releasing hormones into, right next to the capillary. Okay, it's into the interstitial fluid, but right next to the capillary, they diffuse in the capillary, and where the blood goes is just directly, not too far, to the anterior pituitary. And that's how the control is done here. Okay, so I'm not going to go over every single hormone here because they do produce quite a few. Okay, one of these is growth hormone. So this is a peptide, and the targets, actually they're variable. Any cell in the body, actually, okay, can be influenced by growth hormone. And so it contributes to mitosis, okay, triggers mitosis, and especially when you're growing up to bone, okay, long growth. Okay, so bones like in the humerus and tibia and fibula, femur, other things like that. As you're growing, you know, there's the head of it. This is maybe the knee joint, but always at each end there is an area that is not solid. Okay, it's a growth area. It consists of cartilage, and this is where mitosis happens to occur as the bone grows. Once you reach adulthood and stop growing, these cartilaginous regions will be filled in, mineralized, and there will be no more growth of bone. It can be remodeled, but it won't grow anymore, okay? And this is one of the targets of the growth hormone, all right? Now, some things can go wrong, so it promotes mitosis. So when I say growth, it's promoting mitosis, mitotic division. of those tissues that can produce it. Because some cells in the body, once they reach maturity, they no longer divide. But cells that happen to still be mitotic in the adult, then they can be stimulated by growth hormone. Now, if there's something wrong with the anterior pituitary, a lot of times it's a tumor that leads to overproduction of growth hormone during the adolescent years, then it can lead to gigantism. Okay, so individuals who are exceptionally big, usually they don't live long because that's a real strain on the heart. This is about a 5'8" individual right here. This is an individual who had one of these problems. Therefore, they're about sometimes 8 feet tall, or sometimes even taller than that. But it's a real strain on their heart, okay? And they usually don't live long. If it's underproduction, then what happens is dwarfism. So the bones, the long bones, are terribly short because they did not grow. And now, if this is caught early enough now, okay, modern times, then artificial growth hormone that has been produced by recombinant DNA mechanisms can be given to the individual, and they will grow up normally. Okay, they will be normal. However, if it's not caught, then of course, or in the past before, we can produce growth hormone. Growth hormone is a protein, and therefore it can be generated by recombinant DNA technology. All right, now if it happens overproduction in an adult after these growth regions here in the long bones have been sealed, then it leads to massive growth of cartilage all throughout the body. So in the joints, more cartilage than necessary. Your nose consists of cartilage, a lot of it, and the ear consists of cartilage. Your joints, there's always cartilage there. And so there's this overgrowth of cartilage, and the condition is called acromegaly. Okay, this is about the best picture I can get. You know that ears, nose, other places where it happens to be cartilage are overgrown, and they're larger than what they should be. And especially when it comes to joints, when you have all this cartilage there, it's hard to move and very painful. Okay, it's a very painful condition. All right, okay. Now this hormone has its direct, okay, it's still controlled by the hypothalamus. The release of it, stimulation from the hypothalamus, targets all throughout the body, especially bone and cartilage. So it has a direct effect on the target. All the rest of the hormones I'm going to talk about are called tropic hormones. A tropic hormone, its target is another endocrine gland. Okay, so it will control other endocrine glands. It's not what happens with growth hormone. Growth hormone, it has a direct target in cells throughout the body. But these control other endocrine glands. Okay, two of them that are produced by the anterior pituitary, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. I'm not going to talk much about these right now because in reproduction, the next lecture I get into, that's where they're going to play a role. These are glycopeptides, and they're produced in the anterior pituitary. Their release is controlled once again by releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, but their targets are specific tissues within the gonads, both in males and in females. And of course, the outcome of stimulation of the gonads is a little bit different in males and females, as we'll get to when we get into reproduction. Okay, another hormone that's produced is thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, you can do that. Once again, its release is controlled by the hypothalamus, releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones, whatever the brain, because there's a lot of feedback from conditions in your body that goes to the brain, goes through several circuits in the brain, and eventually to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will control this. So the target is the thyroid gland in the throat, and it stimulates the production and release of thyroid hormones. Okay, so this here, thyroid gland is an endocrine gland, and so it is being controlled by another hormone. Okay? Now these are the various hormones that are produced by the anterior and posterior pituitary. I'm only wanting you to know growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and we will get to follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. The rest of these, okay, those are the posterior pituitaries. The rest of these we're not going to talk about, except for I'm going to add one more, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, it's not on my slide. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. I can't read that. I'll put it up here on the board. And its release controls hormone release in the adrenal glands. Okay, so it's a tropic hormone. It controls the release of hormones in the adrenal glands. It is a major hormone that's released also under stress, long-term stress. Okay, come back to that a little bit later. All right, so those are the hormones of the anterior pituitary that I want you to know. Oh, let me jump back here. At the same time that adrenocorticotropic hormone is produced, is also produce something called an endorphin. Okay, first of all, these are from the same protein, and there's an enzyme that cleaves that protein into two different sections, one of which is adrenocorticotropic hormone. The other one is endorphins. Endorphins are sort of opiates, okay? Opiates has an opiate type of effect on the brain, so makes you feel good, okay? And also it releases or it diminishes the sensation of pain. Okay, all right. So thyroid gland. Thyroid gland produces two different forms of thyroxine. As I mentioned yesterday, thyroxine is derived from an amino acid, tyrosine, and there's two different forms of it. One that has 4 iodine atoms attached to it, one that has 3. Okay, they both are produced. The T4 type is more biologically active. Okay, and so it's modified tyrosine, and of course targets in the cell. Or targets throughout the body. Okay, so these are cells, various tissues, and it regulates metabolic rate. In other words, the cellular respiration, the rate of cellular respiration is either increased or decreased due to whether there's a high amount of thyroxine or a low amount of thyroxine. If something goes wrong with the thyroid gland, and you're not producing enough thyroxine, usually some of the symptoms is severe fatigue, simply because cellular respiration is not being stimulated and the body isn't producing enough ATP. Okay? There's also another hormone that is produced here. This is a protein, calcitonin, and it is involved in regulating calcium content in the body, along with another hormone that comes from 4 patches of cells that are on the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland. However, they have different embryological origins, and therefore they're not considered part of the thyroid gland. It's called the parathyroid gland, and the hormone that it produces is parathyroid hormone. These two work together in an antagonistic fashion, okay, to control calcium content in the body fluids. Calcium is very metabolically important. As we get into muscles and nerve system and a few other things, calcium supplies are very, very important. Furthermore, exocytosis, endocytosis of material into and out of the cell is pretty much controlled by calcium content as well. Therefore, it has to be highly regulated, okay, in very narrow range. So these two work together to control, and the way they do it, so if there's an increase in calcium content, calcium ion, you've drank or eaten in your diet something that's very rich in calcium, then this stimulates the thyroid gland to release calcitonin. Okay, so the trigger is, the stimulus is an increase, high amounts of calcium in the body. And so there's two targets. One is bone, and in fact, more specifically, not just bone, but cells in the bone called osteoblasts. Okay, osteocytes can come into two different forms: osteoblasts, bone-forming cells, and osteoclasts, bones that remodel and break down bone, okay, or cells that break down bone. Okay, so one of the results here is to stimulate in most animals, most vertebrates, to stimulate the osteoblasts to take up calcium and phosphate from the body fluids and deposit it in bone. Now, this particular effect has not been demonstrated in humans. It is in all other vertebrates, dogs, cats. We have experimental evidence for that. The only humans in which the osteoblasts are doing this under the stimulus of calcitonin are pregnant women, okay, because or lactating women, both pregnant, lactating women, because they have a lot of can take up a lot of calcium. But other than that, it doesn't seem to affect humans that much. Another target of calcitonin is the distal and proximal tubules. Distal and proximal tubules of the nephron and the kidneys. So I put up here just kidney, but the direct target, proximal distal tubule. And what it does is it increases the uptake of calcium from, or excuse me, the other way around. It lowers the reabsorption of calcium from filters. So both of these actions will bring calcium levels in the blood down. Okay, that is what the object is. All right, so this leads to a decrease in calcium content in the blood. If calcium decreases too much, then the parathyroid hormone release, or parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone. Okay, and this is antagonistic to the calcitonin. Now, it has the same targets, bone, but it's a little bit more complicated here because it's not just the parathyroid hormone by itself. But it is also vitamin D. Okay, they work together. Okay, they work synergistically, and so the parathyroid hormone and vitamin D. Vitamin D, we call it a vitamin, but in actuality, it is a hormone. Okay, and there's three different types of vitamin D. Vitamin D is made by your skin with an interaction from UV light, and it produces a compound called cholecalciferol. Okay, this is also called D3. Okay, cholecalciferol. That is made within your skin, interacting with UV light. The liver will convert this into hydroxycholecalciferol. This will be circulating in the blood, okay? However, it is still not the effective hormone. This will then, by kidney cells, will be converted into the active form of the hormone, which is called 1,25 di. Cholecalciferol. All right. Now, how much of this do I want you to know? I only want you to know that there's 3 forms of vitamin D. The vitamin D is really a hormone, okay? You don't need to know these big words, except just know that vitamin D3 is produced by UV light in the skin. It's not the active form. The liver will convert it into a second form, and then the kidney into the active form. Okay, this here is a hormone. And the target of both parathyroid hormone and vitamin D are osteoblasts. Osteoblasts in bone. And they work synergistically together. They have to both be there, okay? One or the other by themselves does not lead to any effect. However, the way in which they work is a little bit different. Parathyroid hormone binds to a receptor that has the binding site on the outside of the plasma membrane. Signal transduction pathway. For vitamin D, this here is hydrophobic. Therefore, its receptor is internal. It goes into the nucleus as a transcription factor, because it will bind to its receptor, go into the nucleus, and it changes gene expression. Converting osteoblasts or to osteoclasts. Okay, that transition requires change in gene expression. Change in gene expression, and what this does is it will digest bone, releasing calcium and phosphate, okay, into the blood. All right, so this is when the calcium is too low, all right, brings the calcium levels up. That's the way it operates with bone. And let's go back here, kidneys. So once again, the same target as calcitonin, the proximal and distal tubule cells. And in this case, it increases the reabsorption of calcium, okay, from the kidney filter, which is also bringing calcium back into the body, all right? Now, there's a third thing here for vitamin D by itself, okay? Vitamin D, its active form, also does this. It also has a target of the proximal and distal tubules. It also contributes to the uptake, the reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys. However, it's the parathyroid hormone is a much stronger effect in this environment. Another target of vitamin D that's related here is mucosal cells, certain mucosal cells in the digestive system. And since this is steroid hormone, it changes gene expression. So the way it gets into the mucosal cells is across the membrane, binds to an internal receptor, goes to the nucleus, and it upregulates a gene or a protein called calbindin. Calbindin is very much involved in increasing the absorption of calcium from your diet, okay? So that's, vitamin D is very, very important for your body to absorb from your food calcium, okay? So vitamin D deficiency leads to very, very soft bones because of this. Because the intestine, even if the diet has sufficient calcium, without the action of vitamin D, then calcium won't be taken up in your diet. And bones get very soft and breakable, a disease called rickets. However, the way of action, in fact, it was this that they named vitamin D as a vitamin. It was discovered that way. However, once we understand its mode of action, it isn't acting like other vitamins. Most other vitamins are cofactors for other enzymes and so forth. But this here is like a steroid hormone. And it's really, vitamin D is a hormone. Okay. All right, so they're an antagonistic system that takes care of calcium levels, but also glucose levels are controlled by an antagonistic system. Yes?
A quick question. For the target of the parathyroid hormone or vitamin D, would it also be the proximal distal tubules?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So with both the parathyroid and calcitonin, they both have the same targets, but they act differently. Bone cells, okay, osteoblast, and proximal distal tubules, okay. Vitamin D, okay, its target is bone cells, okay, osteoblast, also proximal and distal tubule, but also the mucosal membrane. Okay, all of them, those two have to, all three of these work together to control calcium content of blood, body fluids. Okay, so nutrition, glucose levels. In fact, it's more complicated than what I'm going to go into. This is just only glucose, but it could also be amino acids. So, so this has to be maintained, blood glucose has to be maintained within certain levels. So if you eat a meal and you take in a lot of glucose, eventually it will reach a certain threshold, even though that all this is going to the liver, still in your circulatory system, glucose levels will still go up to a certain extent. In the pancreas, there are several little clusters of cells that are called islets of Langerhans. Okay, now the pancreas mostly is an exocrine gland. So it produces digestive enzymes through a duct, which are deposited through a duct into the duodenum. However, these clusters of cells here, all throughout the pancreas, called islets of Langerhans, they are endocrine glands. And there's two different types, alpha cells and beta cells. Actually, there's three, alpha, beta, and delta, but we're not going to worry about delta, just looking at alpha, beta cells. The beta cells will produce insulin and release insulin into the circulatory system. So this insulin is, since this is in the pancreas, it is released into the circulatory system that gets into the body through the hepatic portal vessel. So the first place it goes is liver. Okay. Now this binds, insulin is a protein, and it binds to a tyrosine kinase type of receptor. Okay, tyrosine kinase. And what it leads to is the insertion into membranes, plasma membranes all throughout the body of a GLUT transport. In this case it's called GLUT4. GLUT4. This is inserted into the plasma membrane, much in the same way that GLUT2 that I talked about in the intestine, and also aquaporins in the collecting ducts. These are in vesicles that then fuse to the membrane, and this allows the uptake of glucose. Okay. What also stimulates the release of insulin is not just only glucose, but amino acids as well. Because most of the time we hear insulin in the context of glucose. However, it controls a lot of nutritional nutrients. So after a meal, it encourages and induces adipose cells to take up fatty acids and glycerol, converting it to triglycerides. It also stimulates cells all throughout the body to take up amino acids and convert them into proteins, okay? Not just donate glucose in the liver, mostly in the liver and skeletal muscle, to store it as glycogen, right? Now, if glucose levels drop sufficiently, then that stimulates alpha cells. Alpha cells will then release another hormone called glucagon. And glucagon is antagonistic to insulin. It does just the opposite. It stimulates the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose. Okay. All right, now this is during regular control of blood sugar. Okay. However, under extreme stress, there's some other inputs that I've already mentioned, namely epinephrine. Epinephrine also does this, okay? Because during stress reaction, then the amount of nutrients in the blood for cellular respiration has to increase. And the insulin by itself is not affected by that stress. So the extra insulin that is released during stress reactions is due to epinephrine, not this. So this is just under normal, non-stressed conditions. So these are antagonistic to each other. Now, diabetes. This is when insulin levels in the blood get real high, so high that glucose shows up in the urine. Okay, so that you have so much glucose in the blood that the kidneys cannot reabsorb it. And furthermore, it leads to other things. It destroys the liver, destroys your eyesight, and a lot of other problems. And there's actually two different forms of it, diabetes 1, diabetes 2, type 1, type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is insulin dependent, okay? And it is an autoimmune disease. So what happens here is that your immune system cannot tell self from non-self sufficiently, that it starts attacking and destroying beta cells. And when those beta cells are destroyed, then there's no longer any insulin. And insulin is the only hormone that can bring glucose levels down, okay? Glucagon and epinephrine and even some others can bring glucose levels up, but only insulin will bring it down, okay? And so as these beta cells are destroyed, then you have, the cells will not be taking up glucose. All right, that's type 1. The way to correct it is that an individual can take insulin shots, okay? So they have to time it just right. So that's type 1. Now type 2 diabetes, which is almost getting to be pandemic. It's getting widespread, not just only in rich Western countries, but also in developing countries as well because of their diet, is type 2 diabetes. This is due to the insulin receptor. Okay, it's called insulin resistance. So there's plenty of insulin that's produced, but the insulin receptor will not respond. And usually this is due to being overfed, overweight, and with lack of exercise, it leads to insulin resistance. The exact mode of how it comes about is not so certain, but it is affecting the insulin receptor, not insulin itself. And if that doesn't work, then we don't get insulin taken up. All right? Okay, so yeah. And here, taking insulin shots does no good. So the only way to control type 2 diabetes is by lifestyle changes. Diet, lifestyle changes. Okay, adrenal glands. Just like the kidney, these glands are divided into an outer cortex and an inner medulla. And both of these areas produce different types of hormones. So it's the medulla that produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, these are called also adrenaline, noradrenaline, and they're released under acute stress, okay, for the fight and flight syndrome. And their target, I've already went through epinephrine And norepinephrine has similar effects as epinephrine, similar targets. However, they have different receptors, all right? Slightly different receptors. But I've already mentioned many of the targets of epinephrine. One of them here, when stress, of course, is liver and skeletal muscle. They induce enzymes to break down glycogen into glucose, okay? Because glucose levels have to go up. Also another target, I mentioned before, is adipose tissue. And so epinephrine will lead to pathways that will break down triglycerides and release into the blood fatty acids and glycerols, which can be used in cellular respiration as well. It also increases, another target is the heart. It increases stroke volume and output. And all these I've mentioned yesterday, okay, just reiterating it. Bronchioles, smooth muscle in bronchioles, smooth muscles in bronchioles, leading them to vasodilate, so that the air passageways are larger diameter, so that more oxygen can be delivered to the lungs and into the blood. Smooth muscles in blood vessels, arteries, arterioles, going to the skin, they vasoconstrict. This is also something I mentioned yesterday. So when you say the target, it's more than just blood vessels, okay? Because this has no effect on veins, okay? Furthermore, it isn't the whole artery that is in question here. Remember, the arteries have endothelia, they have smooth muscle, and they have connective tissue. Connective tissue plays no role, okay? What is the actual target is the smooth muscle. That's what vasoconstricts, okay? Whereas smooth muscle in the blood vessels, arterioles, arteries going to brain and heart, skeletal muscle, those vasodilate, because those areas need a greater delivery of oxygen, glucose, fatty acids, in order to respond for the stress. Okay, this is for short-term stress. All right, now the cortex, it produces steroids, okay? So epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are modified tyrosines, okay? They're biogenic amines, but in the cortex, these are steroids. So there's a group of hormones that are called corticosteroids. These are also released under stress. And their release is highly controlled by that adenocorticotropic hormone that I wrote up on the board earlier, ACTH, from the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so sensations of stress in the brain lead to releasing hormones in the hypothalamus that stimulate the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which then will stimulate the adrenal glands to release corticosteroids, right? There's two different types here, mineral corticoids and glucocorticoids. This is the one, glucocorticoids, that are released during stress, not the mineral corticoids. So I have this a little bit, let's back up here, make sure everyone has it straight. Two different types of cortical steroids. Mineral corticoids, in which aldosterone is the main one. We've already talked about that, and glucocorticoids. So the stress release is for the glucocorticoids. Okay, and they reinforce the actions of epinephrine, also from stress. However, this is usually, epinephrine is short-term stress. This is usually long-term stress, such as starvation, okay, for example. Okay, all right. These are also anti-inflammatory, at least in the short term. If stress goes on chronically, again and again, then these will become inflammatory, okay? That's one of the problems with long-term stress. These are beneficial with short-term stress, but not chronic stress that goes on for weeks or months and so forth. This also produces certain types of sex hormones, including a certain amount of testosterone and estrogen, although it is the gonads that primarily produce this. All right, so the gonads, I'm not going to talk too much about them right now, because that will be in the next lecture. We'll go into a lot of details on these hormones, but they also produce steroids. And function of these steroids, puberty, they induce maturation, growth and maturation of the reproductive system. Reproductive system is there from birth, but it's not fully developed. And it takes steroids. Once puberty is reached, and this is under the stimulation of the hypothalamus as well, as I'll get into a little bit later, then once the reproductive system has been matured, then these hormones still play a role in reproductive cycles and reproductive behavior in all animals, including humans. Okay? All right, so that's the end of the coverage of the hormones. Any questions before I go on to the next one, which is reproduction? And in reproduction, we're going to meet some other hormones that are very complicated, especially in females. Yeah.
On the previous slide, what did you mean by stroke volume? So it's like.
Okay, we went over stroke volume before. It's the amount of blood that the left ventricle is pumping out per beat. Okay, all right, so that increases. Yes?
So you were talking about how vitamin D and, I'm not sure what that was again, but those, that they have synergetic relationships, so.
Vitamin D and parathyroid hormone.
Could you go over that, because like, I was a little confused about like how we could have that type of relationship, but vitamin D can also go, like, it has like its own individual, like things that it can do too. I just wasn't sure about that.
Okay. Yeah, because well, I have it here is a flow diagram. So parathyroid gland, it will release parathyroid hormone. Okay, let's also get this up here. Let me just back this up. So you also have a relationship here as well. So this is under when calcium levels are too low. Okay, calcium levels are too low. So the stimulus is low calcium levels. Okay, high calcium levels actually suppress this. Okay, it has a sensor for calcium, but high levels will suppress it. Low levels, it will release this hormone, and the proximal and distal tubules, this is one of the targets, okay? And by itself, without vitamin D, okay, this here will increase calcium reabsorption. So it increases the number of calcium transporters that will bring calcium back into the blood. Something I didn't mention here, it also active form. So remember that the vitamin D, it is put in its final active form by being converted from an inactive form to an active form in the kidney. And that stimulation is also from the parathyroid hormone. Okay, Another target of parathyroid hormone osteoclast in bone. Actually, osteoblasts. And this stimulates their conversion to osteoclasts, which then break down the bone, release calcium, and phosphate into blood. Okay, because what's the problem here? Because we're having too low of calcium. So this will bring calcium levels up. Yes.
Is it parathyroid hormone that does that, or is it vitamin D?
Well, okay, I'm getting there, because it's, this here also requires the active form vitamin D.
Okay.
So this is synergistic. One by themselves doesn't do it. In this case, it takes both. Okay. They operate on osteoblasts a little differently. However, this here especially is what leads to a change in gene expression. But this is synergistic. Both this and this have to be together. Whereas over here, yes, vitamin D does promote this. Okay, it does promote that. In fact, it's being produced right here. All right, but its effect is not as strong as parathyroid hormone. So here, parathyroid hormone is the major player for the reabsorption of calcium. Another target of vitamin D, mucosal membrane in small intestine, duodenum. And that leads to uptake of calcium from your diet by producing calcinin. All of these are for increasing calcium under low calcium conditions. Okay, now I want to point out something here that's sort of interesting, is that in humans, especially in humans, if you don't have enough calcium in your diet all throughout life, this system here is removing calcium from your bones. And as you get older, the bones will get weaker and weaker and weaker because you're removing skeletal matter there. And it leads mostly in women to osteoporosis. Okay? Osteoporosis is weak bones that can break down very easily. Older women can just barely sometimes sit down on a chair too hard and it'll break a hip bone. Okay, because there's just too little calcium phosphate in their bones. So this leads to osteoporosis, and one way to treat it is to give calcitonin. However, human calcitonin doesn't seem to be very effective for humans. And so they take a version of calcitonin from salmon fish. The amino acid sequence is very similar. It's not identical, but the calcitonin still binds the calcitonin receptor on these cells more strongly than the human form does, and stays there a lot longer. Therefore, it is more effective in preventing the breakdown of bone over time. Okay, does that get it? Okay, anything else? Okay, then I'm going to go on to reproductive system, because that's what we'll be looking at tomorrow in class. Animal reproduction, and mostly in this, first of all, I'll talk about animal reproduction in the general terms, but then afterwards we're mostly going to concentrate based on humans. Okay, so just overview of reproduction here is reproduction is the production of a new individual, a new separate individual that has their own metabolic destiny, okay, separate from anyone else. And in animals, that can, reproduction can still be sexual or asexual. Most vertebrates will reproduce sexually. However, some other groups of animals that we've talked about have the capacity to be able to reproduce asexually. So the major differences here between sexual and asexual reproduction is asexual reproduction. There is usually one parent, and all the genes of that parent go to the offspring. The offspring is cloned. They're genetically identical to the parent. Whereas sexual reproduction usually takes two individuals, each of which contribute 1/2 of the genes to the offspring. And therefore the offspring are genetically new. They have a new combination of alleles different from both parents. Okay, usually asexual reproduction in animals is associated in general with stable environments that do not change much over time. Okay, sexual reproduction is probably evolved in eukaryotes to begin with to generate genetic diversity, okay? Otherwise, if everyone is identical, then if the environment kills one, the environment kills all. But if we have genetic diversity, some of them may be genetic types that can survive. So in animals, it can be fragmentation, okay? And well, a lot of times this fragmentation can be accidental. For example, with starfish, you can cut them in half. In fact, you can cut them into fourths. And as long as part of the central disc of a starfish is there, they will regenerate the missing parts. And this is a type of asexual reproduction. Others, so this fragmentation in Porifera, Cnidaria, Tychominthes, Annelida, Chirodermata. So these are groups of animals that we've talked about in which fragmentation can take place, asexual reproduction. In Cnidarians, they can do budding. Okay, so this is not accidental. This fragmentation up here a lot of times is, but with things like hydrozoas, they will have a place here where there's rapid amount of mitosis that produces a bud that resembles the hydra that will eventually break off and become a separate individual. So budding can happen as well. And then fission. Okay, sea anemones, also Cnidaria, they do this. It's almost like cell division, but it affects the whole body. So these polyps will just start to split in two. There will be a fissure that goes down the middle of them, and the two sides will just completely pull apart, and you'll have two different genetically identical sea anemones, individuals. Even in those animals which can reproduce asexually, they usually also can reproduce sexually. All right, and in fact, in animals, sexual reproduction is more general. All right, so here it always involves haploid gametes of two different types, a sperm and an egg. Usually the sperms are small, they don't have a whole lot of cytoplasm. Basically, all that they're carrying is just only genetic information, whereas the egg is relatively large. And once they fuse together, this becomes a diploid zygote, which then will undergo further development. So the gametes are always produced in gonads, two different types, testes, ovaries. Testes will produce sperm, ovaries produce eggs. Okay? Now, as far as the distribution of gametes in species, there's two different varieties. I've brought this up before. Monoecious. Species are monoecious if the individual carries both ovaries and testes. For example, earthworms. They have both ovaries and testes. And usually monoeciousness is mainly found in those species of animal or groups of animals in which running into another individual is relatively rare. So earthworms are in soil and they're digging through the soil. They don't have a good enough sensory systems to attract each other. And so when two earthworms run into each other, it's a lot of times accidental. Okay, and so they want to make the most of it. Also burying animals, that's common. Also, animals that don't move much. Okay, this is what agility means. Agility means the ability to move. And so some animals that are stationary, therefore, if they're stationary, don't move around, they're not going to run into a mate. Okay, therefore, monaciousness is more common among these types of animals. So even when they are monacious, with having their own production of sperm and eggs, usually outcrossing is the rule. It's very rare that they will be able to fertilize their own eggs with their own sperm. That does happen a little bit, but not very often. So since when they do undergo sexual exchange of sperm, that sperm is often stored in a structure that's called a spermatheca, so that, and can be kept alive until times are appropriate for laying eggs. Because at the time, it may not be the right environment, might not be the right conditions to be able to produce eggs and offspring. So that sperm can be saved for later. Okay. All right, dioeciousness, this is when they have separate sexes and separate individuals. So there are males and females. Males have testes and produce sperm. Females have ovaries and produce eggs. And we have both monacious and dioecious animals, throughout the animal kingdom. Okay, most for aquatic invertebrates, all the groups except for the vertebrata, but not exclusively, fertilization is external. Now, still males and females have to come close together because sperm cannot swim from the coast of California to Japan to fertilize an egg, all right? That's just way too far. So they may engage in certain types of behaviors that will bring males and females together, induce the female to release her eggs, and the male in the same vicinity will release his sperm. Then fertilization takes place outside of the body. That's real common. That's also true of frogs, amphibians, external fertilization. Now, you often will find that a male frog will grab onto a female frog, and this is also true of salamanders as well. And right on the back, this is not copulation, okay? This is not copulation. There is no penis that is being inserted into the female. This is called amplexus, and this is a behavior because the male is inducing the female to release her eggs, okay? As soon as she releases the eggs, which are right down here, all those black spots are eggs that are being released externally to into the water, then he will let go of the female and spread his sperm on the eggs outside of the female's body, okay? So this is still external fertilization, not internal. Internal is pretty common in terrestrial animals for the simple reason that if you had the type of behavior of frogs, now frogs are doing this in water, okay? That's where the eggs are laid, in water. And the eggs will hatch in water. The tadpoles, larvae, will live in water until they reach an old enough age that they undergo metamorphosis into the adult frog, which will then be on land. But with terrestrial animals, you tend to spread eggs out on the surface and sperm out on the surface because this is a desiccating environment. Furthermore, sperm doesn't travel through air, okay? No matter how vigorously the flagella happen to be beating. Therefore, internal fertilization. So this requires copulatory organs. The male has to have some sort of copulatory organ which is inserted into the female so that the sperm in an aqueous, moist environment is transferred from the male to the female. So the eggs still have to stay in a moist environment. And so this happens with annelids. Even though annelids are still in moist soil, a lot of times it's still desiccating enough that their reproduction would not work unless it was internal fertilization. All insects, spiders, and all amniotes have internal fertilization. But even some sharks, although they're living in water, will still have internal fertilization. But it's much, as a generalization, it's much more common in terrestrial animals. This prevents gametes from drying out. And also from the developing embryo from drying out. So it requires copulatory organs, and oftentimes these animals have to evolve certain types of stereotyped behaviors so that it brings both the male and female into type of behavior where they can cooperate, because copulation requires certain degree of cooperation. Okay, now as far as eggs. In biology, we use this word egg in two different senses. One, we use it to refer to a haploid gamete, a single cell, also called an egg. However, it is also the structure in which an embryo develops. Okay, that's the difference. That began as an egg. The original gamete egg usually has a lot of food stores put into it, and therefore it's much bigger than the sperm cell. Then once fertilization takes place, however, the developing embryo stays within that structure, and now it is egg in a different sense, namely the structure in which the embryo happens to develop. Okay, so it's female gamete, or it is structure that contains the embryo until it hatches. Okay, and this is when it's the embryo is developing. This is called embryological development. After it hatches out of the egg, the animal still continues development, but now it's called post-embryonic development. Okay, now eggs, there's three different patterns of egg support. Animals that are oviparous, once the egg has been fertilized, there's lots of yolk inside of it. The yolk contains carbohydrates, proteins, fatty acids, and other things needed to build the embryo. Then they will just simply lay the egg somewhere, run off, and never see them again. Okay, this is oviparous. They lay eggs and completely nourished. The embryo is completely nourished by yolk, and oftentimes will never ever see their parents. Okay, they have a lot of hardwired behaviors in their nervous system. So insects and spiders are good examples of this. Some reptiles and birds also are this as well. Birds lay eggs. However, in the case of birds, they also will incubate the eggs. They will also stay there and protect the eggs. And some insects will do that as well. Okay? And also monotremes. Okay? The two different monotremes that live in Australia, they're the only egg-laying mammals, but that was probably plesiomorphic even for ancestral mammals to lay eggs. But oviviparous is somewhere in between. Still, the eggs are kept, in this case, they're not immediately laid after fertilization. They are fertilized, but they're retained in the oviduct of the female. They stay inside. However, there is no connection between the embryo developing and the parent, the mother. Still, all of the materials necessary for the embryo to develop are still inside of the egg. They had to be put there in the yolk. And then the egg is then hatched inside of the oviduct, and the young will come out. Okay, sharks do this, for example. Now, and some snakes will do this as well. Now, what advantage do you think this has evolutionarily? It actually has both, it's both advantageous and also risky.
It protects
Protects the eggs, okay? Some insects will just lay their eggs and run away. Sea turtles do that too. They bury them in the sand and they go back to the sea. So predators can come along, and this is going to protect the eggs. But here, if the eggs are kept inside of the female can protect the eggs. Okay, that's an advantage, but it's also a disadvantage. Why would it be a disadvantage?
I mean, is
isn't it? If the female gets attacked, then you lose.
Yeah, so, the female is more vulnerable to attack by predators. Okay, they have less ability to get away if they're carrying a bunch of eggs. All right, so there's sort of a trade-off there. So sharks do this, some fish, some reptiles, and then another pattern of development here is viviparous. And here, there is, the embryos are indeed in an egg, but the egg doesn't have a shell, all right? Starts out fertilized, and it is retained inside of the mother, and it is nourished by the mother's fluids. And so these eggs are not packed with yolk, okay? They're smaller, and so this is widespread with placental mammals. Okay, the placental mammals, there is a connection between the developing embryo and the blood system of the mother, called a placenta. Now, so this viviparous is not limited to just placental mammals. It's the best example. There are some flies, for example, the tsetse fly, and actually there's some other related types of flies, that they will keep the eggs inside. They hatch into maggots. The maggots stay inside of the female. Actually, before that, there's a little bit of a milk gland. We call it a milk gland, but it's not really milk, but it nourishes the embryos that are developing, and it's still viviparous. Okay, now there's some other interesting types, patterns of reproduction called parthenogenesis. And there's two different broad categories. This is actually asexual, but it's developed and evolved from a sexual system, okay? So it's a little bit of both. So this is development from unfertilized eggs. Now, eggs are produced sexually by meiosis. So it's part of a sexual reproductive system, but still they hatch, they would develop without being fertilized by sperm. And so there's two different types here, apomictic parthenogenesis. And this is simply that the eggs during meiosis fail to separate. The chromosomes fail to separate. So that the egg is diploid, okay? So this is a failure of eggs to undergo meiosis. They undergo meiosis, but the chromosomes don't separate. That's the whole point. So that one of the outcomes is that you have an egg that is diploid to begin with, and therefore it will develop. Another form, so this retains the completely, it's a clone of the mother. Completely identical to the mother, okay? Completely identical to the mother. And this is real common in insects. There's something also called automictic parthenogenesis. And in this case, fertilization is not by a sperm, but is by a product of meiosis. As I'll get to momentarily, when eggs undergo meiosis, they first of all, well, I'll go ahead and do this, even though I'm going to bring it up a little bit later. Have something that is called primary oocyte. It will undergo meiosis 1, and it results in cytokinesis is very unequal. So that it will have one large secondary oocyte plus what is called a polar body, the first. Okay, which is that cell. Both of these are haploid because it went through meiosis 1. Meiosis 1 is a reduction division. So the chromosomes are cut in half, or set numbers are set in half. Then this will go through meiosis 2. Usually this polar body will disintegrate, okay? It doesn't have any role, but this will now produce an ovum, egg in the typical sense, haploid, plus another polar body. Both of which are haploid. What happens at this stage is that the second polar body and the ovum fuse together. And therefore it produces a fertilized ovum, so that you have now a diploid zygote, where both sets of chromosomes still came from the mother, no contribution to the father, okay? And so they lay a diploid egg. So this is also true in some insects, things like, in fact, we find in insects both apomictic and polymictic parthenogenesis. It's still development from an egg that was not fertilized. Okay, another pattern of reproduction is something that occurs in one branch of insects. This is called haplodiploidy. Okay, so this haplodiploidy happens in a group of insects called Hymenoptera. In a Linnaean system, Hymenoptera is an order. Okay, it includes bees, ants, wasps. Okay, many of these are social insects, namely that they live in large colonies. There are some that are solitary, but a lot of them, especially all ants are social. They live in large colonies where there's an overabundance of females. Males are very, very rare. And so what happens in here is that the males are produced from unfertilized eggs. Males are produced from unfertilized eggs, so they are haploid. They are haploid, one set of chromosomes. The females, which are more abundant than anything, are from fertilized eggs, and they are diploid. So sex determination in the Hymenoptera is not due to X and Y chromosomes. It's due to sets of chromosomes. A male has one set of chromosomes, female has two sets of chromosomes. So the queens, of course, are diploid, and if they're in social, in a hive, then the queen will mate with a male, and she stores the sperm in a spermatheca. Then she has control over whether to fertilize an egg or not. Most of the eggs she will fertilize, they will be females, and they will be workers and soldiers. They are the ones who go out, gather the food, and protect the hive from attack and other things like that. But every now and then, especially if this colony gets too large and it needs to split, she will also produce males, okay, by not fertilizing an egg. Okay, so that some of the fertilized eggs will become reproductive females. Most of the females, their reproduction is suppressed. They will not reproduce. Only certain ones, the queen, and if the colony is going to split, then the queen will produce other females that have wings, okay? And their reproductives will produce some males that have wings. They will fly off, mate, and start a new colony. The males usually don't do anything. When they do have males in the hive, they just eat food, and eventually the workers will kill them. Okay, just get rid of them, because they're absolutely useless except for mating, all right? And that's not necessary unless the colony needs to grow or split. Okay, so those are just some patterns throughout the animal world. We get a little bit biased about our own reproductive strategies, but now I'm going to spend the rest of the time just talking about mammals, not necessarily us, but mammals. Okay, reproductive system. So the male reproductive system and the production of sperm, how it comes about, and then we'll look at the female system. I hope I can get at least to the anatomy of both before this is over, because that's what you need to look at in lab tomorrow. Okay, so the process in mammals, of producing sperm is called spermatogenesis. And where it happens is in the testes. So these testes, like the kidneys, look like they're solid objects, but if you take a knife, cut through it, and look at it, it looks like the internal part is filled with spaghetti, okay? Tubes, just like the kidneys. Kidneys are filled with nephrons. Testes are filled with seminiferous tubules. And this is where spermatogenesis takes place, is in seminiferous tubules. First of all, let's look at the anatomy of the male system, because you'll be looking at slides of this tomorrow. Testes in males are in a bag that sticks outside the body called the scrotum. Now, in most other animals, other than mammals, the testes are internal, they're not external. When you dissected the frog, where did you find the testes? And the shark? They were inside. Okay, this is something for mammals. Why? We don't know. Okay, except for spermatogenesis in mammals has to proceed at a lower temperature than body temperature. Now, why that is, we don't know. But if these were inside where it was nice and warm, spermatogenesis would not work. Okay, so they're outside the body. All right, so sperm is produced in here, and I'll get into that momentarily. Stored in a bag that's over the testes called the epididymis. Okay, epididymis. During ejaculation, this is sperm is projected out by muscle contractions, smooth muscle contractions that move in a rhythmic manner. And so here it would lead into the vas deferens. There's one for each testis. Goes back up into the body, over the urinary bladder to the back side, where the two vas deferentia will come together in a very, very short tube, single tube, called the ejaculatory duct. Okay? And is that up there, that word? Don't see it, but that little piece there is called the ejaculatory duct. Then this empties into the urethra, just below the prostate gland. So in males, the urethra is a common passageway for both urine and sperm. Okay? That's different in females. Passageways are separate. Okay? All right, so, and then out through the penis is where the urethra happens to go. All right, now associated with this system is also several glands. The prostate gland, which is just below the urinary bladder, and it completely surrounds the urethra. Okay, the urethra is going through it. And a pair of glands called seminal vesicles that are just behind the bladder. During ejaculation, all of these add material to what is being ejaculated. All right? And I'll come back to that as well. Furthermore, at the base of the penis inside, there's a pair of glands called the vulval urethral gland, and we'll talk about what they do. Probably not today, we'll see. If we look at this in front, then once again, testes left and right, epididymis, vas deferens, it goes around, and you can't see where they join together. They're joined together in a short ejaculatory duct, empty into the urethra, okay? And other stuff here I'm not going to talk about, just like prostate gland, ovourethral gland, epididymis, testes. Just the things I'm mentioning are the things that are important here. All right? Okay, so the scrotum, it contains smooth muscles that are called Dartos muscles, because under stimulation of temperature, these muscles can relax so that the testes are pushed further away from the body, or they can contract and bring the testes closer to the body. The whole function of this is to keep the testes at the right temperature. Okay, if it's too warm, the dartos muscle will relax and the testes will get further away from the body. If it's too cold, the dartos muscles will contract and bring the testes closer. Because as I said, spermatogenesis in mammals is temperature dependent, and it has to be a lower temperature than body temperature. Okay? Now these accessory glands, they add secretion. So semen, sperm are not synonymous. They're not the same thing. Sperm are gametes, okay? But what is ejaculated is more than just the sperm. In fact, although the sperm cells count in the millions during an ejaculation, they still constitute a very, very, very minute part of the volume. Most of that is secretions from the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. So with the seminal vesicles, those are paired, and what they contain amino acids, and fructose. Now, a sperm cell in mammals really doesn't have a whole lot of anything in it. It's mostly a head piece, which almost all of it is nucleus. Tail piece, flagellum, it has a huge mitochondrion at the base, but there is no cellular or very little cellular respiration in here. Or Golgi body, etc., ribosomes, they're not there. All right, so very little. So it doesn't have a stored supply of, what noise is that? Was that from me? Or from everybody?
I think it's from the projector.
Projector. They don't like this lecture. Okay. Anyway, there's no storage of any sort of energy supplies. This is supplied in the secretions from these seminal vesicles. Also, it contains fatty acid signals. They're called prostaglandins. Okay. There's many different types of prostaglandins. They're derived from a 22 carbon fatty acid called arachidonic acid. You don't need to know that word. But some of these prostaglandins in our body, they stimulate the sensation of pain. These are different prostaglandins here. They have a different function. But here, the prostaglandins, what they do, they're hormone-like. And they will, but they don't work in the male, they work in the female. Okay? So once they are deposited in the vagina, sperm will eventually get up into the uterus, and this here stimulates rhythmic contractions of the uterus muscles that draw the sperm further up into the reproductive system. Okay? Because fertilization does not take place in the uterus, fertilization does not take place in the vagina. It's further up in the system where that will happen. And that's too far for sperm cells to swim. And therefore, there's other mechanisms to draw it up. Where prostate gland, okay, this is just below the bladder. The secretions from this empty right into the urethra during ejaculation. And one thing is it balances pH in the vagina. Many openings, for example, or entries into the body, for example, the stomach, are acidified. And the vagina is acidified as well. Okay, there's bacteria there that are functional symbionts that will break glycogen into various forms of acids that bring the pH down, because that is the place for bacterial, also for bacterial infections. And so lowering acidity is a protection. However, sperm cells are also damaged by pH, and therefore this here neutralizes that pH in the vagina so that the sperm cells stay alive. And furthermore, they contain compounds that then activate the sperm. Up to this time, the sperm flagella was not moving. So moving through the reproductive system during ejaculation does not involve the flagella of the sperm. It involves smooth muscles that push all this stuff out. Once it's in the vagina, however, deposited, then the sperm is activated and the flagella will beat, okay, from this activation. The bulbourethral gland actually begins its secretion before ejaculation. So during the arousal state of sex, so it will send a fluid down, because it is down the urethra of the male, because this is a passageway for urine, and urine very often can be acidic. Urine can also be alkaline, but if it is acidic, this here neutralizes the passageway for sperm, because it protects them. Okay? All right. So looks like I'm not going to be able to. I can get into the spermatogenesis. These are seminal vesicles that happen to be in our seminiferous tubules. There's a tube, and when you look at slides tomorrow, you're going to see all these tubes, and it's in here along the outside that there is an epithelium, okay, with stem cells. Stem cells that are diploid, that will begin the process of spermatogenesis. So what happens first here is that, of course, we have a stem cell that's called a spermatogonium. These will be found right up against the basement membrane. So on the outer part of the seminiferous tubule. Now this is diploid. It will divide by mitosis and it will produce two cells, one of which remains a spermatogonium, the other which becomes a primary spermatocyte. So this was mitosis. So the primary spermatocyte is still diploid, okay? And therefore it will be located on the inside of the spermatogonium. Primary spermatocyte will then undergo meiosis, one, producing a secondary spermatocyte. Secondary spermatocyte is now haploid. Secondary spermatocyte will undergo meiosis 2, producing 4 spermatids, what are still haploid. Spermatids will then develop, into sperm cells. So the spermatid is an early form of the sperm cells. Okay? Now during all this, they are nourished by cells that are in here called Sertoli cells. So they have cytoplasmic extensions that are joined to the plasma membrane of the developing spermatocytes, and they are helping with their development by putting in certain messenger RNA and so forth, all right, and nutrients. And I'll just do this and quit. The spermatid has to mature, and during this maturation, it loses much of its cytoplasm. Where does that cytoplasm go? Sertoli cells. Okay, Sertoli cells are connected. And it will develop a flagellum. And at anterior part, an acrosome, which contains hydrolytic enzymes. This acrosome is derived from lysosomes. At the base of the flagellum, it will have a mitochondrion. Okay, so this is now a spermatozoan. This is now a spermatozoan. And it is stored in the epididymis until ejaculation. If ejaculation doesn't happen, the sperm cells will eventually be absorbed by the body, broken down, because in males, this spermatogenesis is continuously going on, okay? And so if it's not used, it'll be destroyed and recycled. Okay, this is where I'm going to stop. Too bad, I really wished I'd gotten into the female system, because I'll probably in the morning, before you start the lab, at least briefly go through the parts of the female system. Okay? We still have yet to get to the hormonal controls. You guys are gonna love the hormonal controls system. Okay, any questions? Okay, that's it.